So hello everyone, and welcome to the Sight and Life's third webinar in a series of 4, focusing on behavior change communication. A special welcome back to those who attended our previous webinars, and to those joining us for the first time. We're delighted that you could log in today. If you would like to hear what we discussed in webinar 1 and 2, a link to the slides and the recording is available in the resource tab on our website, sightandlife.org. As we mentioned in our first webinar on the 24th of April, this series examines the BCC process from the program manager's point of view. And we emphasize the experiential knowledge combined with research analysis, and we identify tools and tips to help the program manager manage the BCC process. In our last webinar titled Assessing the Situation, What You Need to Know, we looked at the program manager's knowledge needs in step 2 through the desk review and step 3 through client research. And in step 2, we examined the broader environment and the programmatic context using a combination of methods for knowledge generation. We talked about participatory techniques, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, using workshops, as well as document reviews. And in step 3, the focus was on using research to generate audience insights. And the insights we defined as those deep truths, the hooks, and the narratives, where we answered the so what question. We also discussed how insights are generated, namely by your choice of inquiry framework and the qualitative methods. So my name is Eva Monterosa. I'm the Senior Scientific Manager at Sight and Life, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's webinar, webinar 3, which is titled BCC Strategy and Roll-Out, The Devil's in the Details. Today's presenter is my colleague, Yana Manyuk. Just a little introduction to Sight and Life. We are a humanitarian nutrition think tank guided by the vision of a world free from malnutrition. We focus on linking research to implementation to support positive nutrition outcomes. Our work involves guiding original nutrition research, disseminating its findings, and facilitating dialogue to bring about positive change. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you're not oriented with Zoom, you will find a toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window, which you may have to hover over your cursor along the lower part of the window for it to appear. Here, in the lower left-hand corner, you can manage your audio settings. The chat box can be found in the middle of the toolbar. If you have any technical difficulties or general questions during the presentation, please type them into your Zoom chat box, and we will do our best to find a solution. You will also find the Zoom Q&A, question and answer, in the lower toolbar. At any time, please submit your questions for the Q&A session following the presentation through the Zoom Q&A chat box, through the Zoom Q&A box, and not the Zoom chat box. We're also active on social media and encourage you to engage with us through our Twitter hashtag #SightandLifeWebinar, which will appear in the chat box. Finally, a PDF of the slides and recording of the webinar will be available at the Sight and Life website shortly after today's webinar. So now most of you have heard plenty about me, so I'll skip my bio. And without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Ms. Yana Manyuk. She is a social marketing specialist at Sight and Life, and she brings 8 years of experience in applying behavior change approaches and methods to a range of projects and programs within governments, the UN agencies, NGO organizations at headquarter level, regional level, and field level. Yana has a Master's of Arts in Health and Social Marketing and a Bachelor of Arts in Cultural Media Studies. So I will hand it over to Yana for the presentation.
Thank you, Eva. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from wherever you are joining us today. I'm speaking to you today from Cairo, Egypt, and I'm very excited to welcome back those of you who joined webinar 1 and 2. And a special thanks again to our internal communications and design team, Nola Martin and Anne Millen, and of course to you, Eva Monterosa, for your expert inputs on this webinar. Today, we will take you on a journey through steps 4 to 7 in the BCC process cycle. And we will start by quickly reviewing the key takeaways from our last webinar to then set the scene for the BCC strategy development. We'll take a closer look at step 4, the creative design, and step 5, pre-testing. We'll then examine the key elements of step 6, training, and step 7, implementation for a successful BCC strategy. So let's recap our key takeaways from step 2 and 3, the desk review and client research, both of which essential prerequisites for strategy design. We ended our last webinar with this checklist. At this point in the process, you have completed the desk review, including a stakeholder analysis and a literature review, and you produced a brief which you have discussed with your brain trust. The Brain Trust is a stakeholder group we introduced in webinar 1, which steers the BCC process. If you want to learn more about the Brain Trust, please review webinar 1. Based on the desk review insights, you have made a go or no-go decision for taking a BCC approach. And your desk review has also allowed you to hypothesize about the key behaviors, which you will need to further research throughout qualitative methods, which you also have selected. And you have thought out about a theoretical framework for the behavior you are addressing. In step 3, client research, you have generated insights about your audience. You've captured these in a report and discussed them with your brain trust to ensure you're all on the same page about the factors that motivate the audience and the barriers which you will need to address moving forward. The client research recommendations should highlight the audience's emotional narratives, which you should leverage to build a strategy, the factors in your audience's lives which compete against the desired behavior, and the exchange your audiences would value for adopting the behavior. This is a concept we will touch upon later in this webinar in more detail. And finally, you should have at least considered the different audience segments who you will target, because as we have mentioned in our last webinar, there is no such thing as targeting the general public. And with this recap, I'd like to open up for a deep dive into BCC strategy design with a quote, which I will now give everyone some time to read. The reason I wanted to share this quote with you is because in our field of work, I often experience that program managers are relying on the provision of information and scientific facts. And while the intention is always to help, no doubt, these strategies rarely achieve any results because they miss to tap into what the audience needs in order to change. And with the BCC process cycle approach, we can create meaningful strategies that use a mix of tactics, not just information, to help people change their behavior. In today's webinar, we will share evidence-based principles and key steps for designing and implementing a holistic BCC strategy. We're also going to discuss key considerations of a BCC training strategy, introduce the elements necessary to plan the BCC strategy implementation, and help program managers sharpen or develop their judgment of quality BCC work from design to implementation. So what exactly makes a BCC strategy different from other approaches? We pulled together a number of key requirements to consider when designing a strategy, and these requirements come from evidence in a behavioral change literature, common elements of successful interventions, and of course, Site and Life's own practical experience. Let's take a look. Your entire thinking process with BCC starts with the audience. To use the good old expression, you literally have to put yourself in their shoes. To generate insight about your audience, we use client research, a step we discussed in webinar 2. And if your strategy is not informed by clear insights, you are very unlikely to achieve any change. A key requirement for strategy design is also to use your understanding of what people really value and desire and leverage that for your strategy. We call this the exchange and you should have a clear understanding of what your exchange is as a result of client research, but we will pick up on the concept again later in this webinar. As your audience is the core of your strategy, it's really important to engage with them in your design process. This usually happens in step 5 of the BCC cycle when we pre-test creative content, which we'll explore a bit later. You can involve your audience in different ways, but getting their feedback on the content you design for them is really critical to BCC strategy design. We know that BCC is as much as a science as it is an art, and therefore the strategy design is often outsourced to an agency or a consultant. And it's really important to begin the outsourcing process as early as possible because procurement processes in most organizations, as we know, can take a very long time. As BCC uses a mix of tactics, it is likely that your strategy will have more than one activity. And all these activities should work to support each other, be it media, community events, or services. Otherwise, your strategy will appear disjointed to both your audience and stakeholders. And when we talk about implementation in step 7 of the BCC process, we will learn how to achieve this alignment. And finally, no matter how creative your approach will be, your strategy will only be as good in the eyes of the donors and stakeholders as its monitoring and evaluation results. So all objectives and activities have to be smart. We will explore in more detail monitoring and evaluation in webinar 4. So what is the role of the program manager in the BCC strategy design? If it is likely that someone else will actually be designing the strategy. I often see that program managers stay out of the design because it is perceived as not their domain of expertise, but the quality of your judgment about the agency's or consultant's work will determine the quality of the overall project. Specifically in the beginning of the design process, when ideas are being generated, your knowledge of the program context and technical nutrition knowledge are absolutely key to determine whether these ideas are actually feasible. In the pre-testing phase, you should use your knowledge of the local culture to assess whether the creative concepts are culturally sensitive and will be accepted by the audience in the first place. When training and implementation plans are developed, it is your call to fully understand capacity needs and make sure all strategy elements are well integrated, and also keep track of timelines and costs to make sure ideas are feasible. Overall, it is really important not to remain a passive recipient of a consultant's or agency's service, but keep learning, stay critical, and build confidence in the application of key BCC principles and requirements. So where do we start with our BCC creative design? I don't mean to sound repetitive, but I really cannot say this enough. We start with the audience. Nutrition BCC is essentially about changing people's daily habits. Put into words of one of my favorite authors, to market a new habit, be it groceries or aerobics, you must understand how to make the novel seem familiar. So how do we do that? The first step in the BCC creative design process is to ask yourself, what can you offer your target audience that's better than what they're currently doing? This is what we call the exchange analysis, which you conduct as the result of your client research in step 3. But we bring this up here because you will be designing your strategy around the exchange. If you think about it, in your programs, you are more likely to ask people to do something they're not really excited about, like to exercise more, eat more spinach, or drop junk food for boring healthy snacks. But how do we get people to consider doing these things? Now you may say that's simple. We just tell them their children won't suffer from anemia if they eat more iron-rich foods, or that they're less likely to die of diabetes in 20 years if they exercise and turn to healthy foods now. These are all solid arguments, but I've never heard of people dropping a burger or running off to get a gym membership because they were warned of long-term risks. Generally speaking, in order to get people to do anything differently, your BCC strategy has to offer short-term benefits, reduce any associated costs, and make the behavioral ask fun, easy to do, and also popular amongst peers in your audience's eyes. The exchange is a fundamental success factor to any BCC strategy. What this exchange will be in your strategy depends entirely on your audience. But to illustrate how an exchange can be defined, and make a huge difference in the success of a strategy, let's look at an example. I'd like to take you to Chesapeake Bay in the Washington, D.C. area, where a social change NGO was trying to solve a very specific problem. The bay was getting more and more polluted, partly because residents would fertilize their lawns in the spring when heavy rains washed the chemicals into the bay. So the behavioral goal of the NGO's strategy was to get people to stop fertilizing their lawns in the spring and instead fertilize in the fall when there is almost no rainfall. And client research with Bay residents showed that an attractive lawn was something homeowners really cared about, and those who cared about their lawns were most likely to fertilize indeed only in the spring. There was also message fatigue around environmental campaigns, which have been running ever since the 1960s. But those same people who fertilized their lawns were also very passionate about their seafood, especially the crab meat, that was becoming scarce because crabs were dying in the polluted bay. Using these insights, the NGO identified an exchange for residents to stop fertilizing in the spring and fertilize in the fall. If you consider the insights you see on the slide, what do you think this exchange was? Are we ready to launch the results, Nola? That's very interesting. Most of you picked protect local seafood so it can be eaten and fertilized in the fall. Okay, so let's look at what the NGO did. So the exchange the NGO offered people for stopping to fertilize in the fall was indeed the promise that there would be continued availability of Chesapeake Bay seafood, especially the crabs, if the sea would be less polluted. The NGO managed to turn the issue into a culinary one instead of using the boring environmental appeals people were getting so tired of. And in spite of a small budget and short campaign run, the evaluation results showed decreased intent to fertilize in the spring, as well as increased awareness of lawn care behavior contributing to pollution. Now, the reason I shared this example with you is to illustrate the importance of listening to the audience and what they really care about in terms of an issue, and how you can tie what they care about with what we care about as professionals. In this case, the audience cared about their seafood, as you rightly guessed, but the NGO managed to tie that in with the bay pollution, and they succeeded to move people in the right direction. Now let's look at a different example related to nutrition, namely breastfeeding. I'd like to take you now to the north of England, a little place called Lancashire. Lancashire had launched lots and lots of campaigns with posters and leaflets and whatnot to get women to initiate breastfeeding because the rates had been consistently low, especially amongst young mothers. But these young mothers, particularly aged 16 to 25, were not at all moved by all these existing campaigns telling them why it was important to breastfeed. So the Lancashire Primary Care Trust decided to take matters into their own hands, and with a relatively small budget, they did client research themselves, by the way, which showed that young moms believed breastfeeding wasn't something they themselves would do. It wasn't for them. In fact, they saw breasts as sexual objects and felt it was kind of gross to breastfeed. What they were influenced by was the glossy celebrity world, even though they felt that they couldn't necessarily live up to that world. They were also very much influenced by their family and peers who didn't support them to breastfeed. And like many young women, unfortunately, in our societies, these moms suffered from an overall self-esteem issue. They were afraid to fail at breastfeeding and were also worried about their bodies and how they would be perceived. And with these insights, the Be a Star campaign was born. Be a Star offered more than information about breastfeeding benefits for the baby or the mom. It offered to celebrate breastfeeding moms as stars, boost the mother's confidence, and support them throughout the process. We will look at how the strategy did that in more detail in a moment, but it was extremely successful in increasing breastfeeding initiation rates in a very short period of time. What this example illustrates is that even something as natural and evidently beneficial as breastfeeding requires an exchange in the audience's eyes of something they really value and get excited about. So once we are clear on what we will offer our audience in exchange for doing the desired behavior, we can now think about the tools and tactics to deliver this exchange to our audience. In other words, we can design our operational mix, which often consists of a mix of communication and sometimes marketing tactics. Let's stick with the Be a Star campaign example to illustrate what we mean. To design the behavioral change operational mix, the team in North England asked a number of questions. First, they asked, what kind of support can we offer these moms to facilitate the adoption of breastfeeding initiation? And the team came up with an in-home and an on-demand peer support service called the Little Angels and Breastmates, and also a 24-hour on-demand helpline and SMS service that moms could call up in the middle of the night if they felt frustrated and wanting to just quit. And secondly, they asked, how can we reduce the cost for adopting the behavior in the eyes of our audience? And we're not talking about monetary cost, but something people perceive as an effort. And the campaign, as we heard earlier, was all about celebration of breastfeeding moms just like them. It was about boosting their confidence and also, most importantly, involving partners and peers. But also, all of the advice and services they offered were free to the audience and easily accessible. They asked, where will our audience do the behavior? How can they access the support? And where can we reach them? In other words, how can we make things more convenient for our audience? The in-home support, the phone lines, the online support, but also advertisements in cafes and bus stops where the mums would hang out was something the team went for. And finally, the team asked, what kind of communication tactics will we use to promote the behavior and support that we offer? They designed makeover and photo shoots for the mothers to create their own local stars, developed websites and a blog, radio advertising, leaflets, posters, and outdoor promotion. This last element, the communication or promotion, is what many focus on. But it's really important to also consider other elements that will likely impact on the audience's decision to change behavior, such as, for example, where they will perform the behavior or access the services you offer, as well as see the promotion you advertise. How you will overcome the barriers to the behavior or reduce your audience's perception of cost associated with it, and which form of support your audience requires to confidently perform the behavior. These key questions originate from the 4 Ps of commercial marketing, but as you can see, they find direct application to public health as a way to facilitate behavior change by making it more attractive, easier, and less costly for the target audience. I would like to spend a moment on promotion, and specifically the development of content, all the creative material and media we associate with BCC. The reason I'd like to focus on content development here is because too often I read BCC strategies with tables of so-called standardized key messages that are expected to be delivered to the community like some kind of words of wisdom. But it's really important to recognize that developing BCC content is much more than just that, and it requires some strategic thinking. Developing content starts with asking ourselves, what do we actually want our audience to do? And what do we want them to know about that behavior? What do we want them to believe? And how do we want them to feel about it? Who will be delivering the message? Choosing a trusted and well-respected voice here is really key for the message appeal. How will our content look and feel? Where will your message appear? The communication channels that are most frequented by your audience. We assembled some tips for you on content development in the green box, which I will leave up here for a few moments for you to read. And now let's look at an example of different message appeals. A company called Grub wanted to get customers interested in eating insects as a source of protein. They tested 3 messages with different appeals at supermarkets where the insects were sold. And you see these 3 message appeals on the screen. The first message, "Dear Mom, loving eating crickets here in Laos, super excited to also be able to get them back home at Trinity Leeds." This message uses a normative appeal in that it tries to normalize the idea of eating crickets at home. The second message uses a rational appeal. It uses rational reasons for eating grubs, such as their nutritional value and sustainability. And the third message focuses on scarcity and the aversion of loss, telling people that they might miss out by not trying the insects. Now, just by looking at these 3 messages, just have a think which message you believe attracted the most number of customers to actually try the insects. In nutrition, we often default to using rational message appeals, like message number 2. But it is really important to try different types of messages with your audience and include emotional appeals as well, like message number 1 and 3, because we know from research that these usually have a higher appeal. In this case, actually, it was message number 3 that attracted the most customers to try the insects, followed by message number 2, both of which contain emotional appeals. And now that we have done the bulk of our strategizing, it is time to bring it all together into a nice and concise document. And here are a few considerations for writing a BCC strategy, which I will leave up for you for a few seconds to read. Now, to turn your strategic ideas that you put into your BCC strategy into actual BCC content and creative material, you will most likely hire a creative agency or consultant. And to communicate key strategy elements, most agencies expect to receive a document which is called the creative brief. It summarizes on 1 page the key elements which creative teams need to know in order to design content which will deliver on your specific strategy objectives. This is usually a 1-pager that contains the purpose of your communication. It describes your target audience demographics, beliefs, behaviors, which you draw from your research insights. It talks about communication objectives and how you want to frame or position the behavior in your audience's eyes, the key benefits that the audience will value the most about the behavior, the strategy elements in your operational mix that you will use to convince the audience to adopt the behavior, how you want the whole creative content to feel and look and sound, and also times and locations where your ad should be placed, which you also draw from your research insights. At this stage of the BCC process cycle, you have commissioned the design of creative content and material and received back some prototypes. However great you think the content is, please do not skip asking your audience how they feel about it. This step is key to BCC strategy design, and it is called pre-testing. We pre-test to make sure that we are still in line with our objectives and that the content has the potential to deliver our strategy. Pre-testing is conducted usually through focus groups or interviews, and it includes a technical accuracy and readability check to make sure that your message is actually literally comprehended by the audience. It also includes understanding whether the audience gets the intended purpose of the message, how it makes them feel, and whether it influences them to act upon it. We have included some sample questions that you might use for pre-testing and adapt to your own scenario, and I will leave them up for you to read for a couple of seconds. Because BCC is embedded in your program, your strategy will include a training element. Let's discuss some key considerations for training those who will actually deliver your BCC activities to the target audience. And I'd like to keep things as simple as possible at this stage, so I will stick to the essentials, such as who needs to be trained on what and why, how you will deliver the training, and when it will take place. So whom will you train? To answer this question, you look back at your BCC strategy and each activity you have planned. In the BS Star example that we just mentioned, in addition to the brand and promotional elements, they had a very strong peer support component to their strategy, if you remember, the little angels and breastmates, which they decided to commission out to an external provider. Surely they could have trained primary care trust employees and used volunteers to pick up the phone and go from home to home. But they knew that this would not be sufficient to build the kind of support the young moms needed to get them through the process. So they opted to invest in a sustainable source of expertise, even though they had a very modest budget. This leads us straight into the next point, the what and the why, the meat of your training, your content. Too often I see training agendas and facilitator guides packed with standard key messages, but stripped of any content that will actually help the service providers do their job in addressing your audience's concerns. An example from our all everyday lives, you know when you call the customer service hotline because you have a specific concern, but none of the pre-dial buttons fit your query. And when you finally get through to the call agent, all he or she does is rattle down standard answers and messages that don't help but irritate you. Now, this is what happens when service providers are trained on standard key messages only and are not equipped with the right knowledge and skills to address individual concerns. To define key topics for your training, go back to each strategy activity and lay out the key knowledge and skills your trainees need to be equipped with to deliver these activities and address audience's needs, which you already know from your client research. And always consider how you can empower staff to feel more confident. This may be through strengthening their communication skills, for example. Any additional information that does not directly serve the strategy's purpose can be summarized in a good-to-know takeaway booklet and handed out to trainees after the training. And finally, it's really important that you try bringing your service providers closer to the experience you want your audience to have, and help them identify with the behaviors, services, or products they will be promoting. You can do that in many different ways. If you are asking them to deal with a product like, let's say, micronutrient powder, have them trial the product, keep a diary of their experiences, and then role play it. What is really important in your training strategy is that you always use your research insights, your client research insights, to inform the who, the what, and the why of your training. Your choice of a training method can actually determine how engaged and motivated your staff will be throughout the program duration and how effective your content will be delivered. Cascade training methodologies, for example, don't always make sense in every context. So your team has to be a bit more creative and think out of the box. There are lots of ways to train people and lots of great projects and organizations to learn from. And we're happy to give more advice on that after the webinar. The timing of your training is a key to succeeding or failing at making sure content sticks with the staff. Make sure you time your training activities as close to the launch as possible and that you plan for hand-holding sessions, feedback sessions, and refresher training if necessary. Also remember that you may not launch all activities at the same time. Your training plan also has to include phases. You may, for example, train your cohort on specific outreach activities, but not yet on conducting cooking classes. Less is more when it comes to absorbing information. We all remember that from school. So keep that in mind when designing your training. All these considerations are things you should start thinking about along your strategy design in step 4 already. Because even though the BCC process is a cycle, it is in reality an iterative process where we must plan steps ahead of their implementation. And now you've come such a long way in your BCC strategy design that energies might be getting a bit low, but the anticipation to launch is growing. And this last step is therefore often missed, as it is assumed, or rather hoped for, that the BCC strategy implementation and rollout will happen automatically on its own. Unfortunately, that is a misconception, and carefully planning the implementation ahead of time, when you have concluded your operational mix in step 5, is key to actually get things going. So let us look at the key elements of an implementation plan. You've already done your budget for the BCC strategy much earlier on in the planning process, but what you have not yet considered is costing each BCC activity. This is not only important for accountability purposes, but to also later allow you to conduct a costing exercise, evaluating how cost efficient each BCC activity actually was in delivering on your objectives. I mentioned this element before when I talked about key requirements for success. When you design a range of activities and even communication material or media, they all fulfill a purpose in themselves, sure. But ultimately, all activities are designed to deliver on the strategy objectives, which means that in your implementation plan, you have to make sure that all activities are orchestrated. Let's say you have planned for social media activities as well as community outreach and events. It would make sense for your social media to cover some of these offline events, or at least be launched in support of each other. It's really important to consider the interplay between all activities, because if you don't, you fail to maximize on synergies that are created by the various activities. More bang for each dollar spent, so to say. And you are also at risk of being perceived as disjointed by your audience and stakeholders. This element somewhat ties in with integration and coordination, but phasing is more about understanding that it may not be efficient to aim for a change in actual behavior in your audience as a first step, but that you may need to build up your audience's awareness, maybe knowledge, and self-confidence before you can actually support the behavioral adoption. For example, if you are introducing a nutrition supplement into a community and there is no awareness of this product, or there may even be some negative preconceived perception around new products in general, it makes little sense to start off your rollout with cooking classes and product distribution. This is because you first need to create awareness and prepare a conducive environment for your audience to feel interested and comfortable to attend these cooking classes and take home the product. So phasing is really about knowing how to sequence your BCC activities, which activity to launch first to meet your audience's needs, instead of pushing them to unattainable goals. And this is where we come to an end with webinar 3. And I will leave this checklist up for you on the screen, summarizing the key steps of BCC strategy design. And while I'll take some of your questions. Thank you so much again for joining us today. I had a really good time and I hope you learned something new and enjoyed the last hour of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Yana. It was a very interesting webinar. I too learned a lot just listening from you. It's now time to hear from the audience. So I've picked up a few questions from the audience Q&A. And please send in your questions because we actually have a lot of time for discussion in this webinar. So as I'm taking questions, please send those in and I will try to get to many as I can. So our first question, Yana, actually comes from Shubhata. And the question is, can you use, or how do you use communication theory in strategy design when time constraints are significant? So I assume that in this question, this person also might not have time for generating audience insights. So how do we draw on existing communication theory in strategy design, for doing that?
I mean, it pains my heart when I hear that there is no time for generating audience insights, of course, because it is a very key element of BCC strategy. And you have seen that it can be done with a small budget and also actually in a very short time. But there's absolutely no time for generating audience insight. And there is absolutely no time for client research or stakeholders and donor pressure. What you can do is you can look at examples of previous interventions that have aimed at addressing the same behaviors you are aiming to address. You can go ahead, be creative, and take a tap in, I wouldn't say the dark, but perhaps, the dawn, and go ahead and design some prototypes of content to then pre-test that content with your audience. And that pre-testing exercise is going to be your chance to generate feedback and some kind of insights from your audience.
Okay, and so the use of communication theory, I know that's something that a lot of people have struggled with. I know theory selection is something that people struggle with even when we talk about generating client research. So we also on the chat box had put in a theory picker website that people can go to, and you can have a look there for finding a theory. But I think that communication theory is something that we should probably pick up more on a blog as well to explain it in more detail. So another interesting question, Yana, comes from Naveen. And this person asks, it seems BCC comes first and then service delivery is afterwards. Can you please elaborate for more understanding?
Service delivery is, or the delivery of a service to support the behavior that you want to address, is a component that you decide on if you see that it is important or critical to provide that service to support your behavior. So in that sense, the service delivery or support component, as we called it, is part of BCC, and it's not something that comes before or after.
Okay, so that's a clarifying question, was that you can also develop a service for the BCC to deliver the BCC component of the intervention.
Right.
Right? Okay. There's another question about the exchange principle. And they're asking, how does the exchange principle work in resource-poor settings where moms are very busy earning an income and have no household help and have many children to care for?
So what is really important to understand about the exchange is that everybody, no matter if they live in a resource poor or resource rich setting, everybody has aspirations, dreams, and values. Everybody desires something, and everybody has something in their lives, values that are important to them. So what is important is not whether you define that exchange in a resource poor or a resource rich setting. What is important is to understand whether what it is that you defined based on hopefully your client research insights is actually something that resonates with the context and the lives of those people. So of course, if you give people an element that you believe they might value that is completely detached from their realistic context, it will not be an exchange, which is why it's really important to understand what it is that your audience values and to try and tie that in with your behavior, which can be a tangible exchange, or it can also be an emotion that you want to evoke.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, Yana. From our work we've done in Rajasthan, which is a very, very poor state in India, we found that, you know, even at that level, when mothers are very busy or they're working out in the fields, they still have aspirations, and a lot of emotional elements came out from those interviews, and we were able to draw on those for creating the exchange. So that's some really good insight there. Another question is around the content strategy. So if you have different audience segments, and we had talked about audience segmentation last time. So if you have a primary or secondary audience segments, doesn't it become quite complicated to develop a content strategy for each of these segments?
Mm-hmm. I think what's really important there is to go for the low-hanging fruit, to first address the segment that you know has the highest potential to change. And you will never be able to or have to address everybody at the same time. So let's say you are working in a community, for example, where the mother-in-law has an incredibly high, not only influence, but actually domination over the behavior of the women in the household, the mothers that you're trying to address. In that case, think about it. Would it make more sense to first address the mother-in-law as a segment or the mother herself? I would say you first go for the mother-in-law to convince her that it makes more sense to adopt the desired behavior for the mom, and then have her convince the mom, which you can then support with promotional material for the mother herself. So it's really about understanding who is the who is your, let's say, influence of the behavior, and or who is the one whom we have to target for the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, low-hanging fruit. I like that term. The other one that most people use is that key entry point, right? What's that one window that if you were to open it, it would really make or break supporting or changing behaviors. So
Right.
that's what you're trying to look for when you do your audience, your client research. That's why we don't like to skip that step. So that's really good feedback, Yana. So looking for that low-hanging fruit and then developing your content strategy around that. Okay, there's some other questions coming in about the role of religious and local leaders in the BCC process. So maybe if you can comment a little bit about that.
Sure. I think with religious and local leaders, it's really, really critical to engage them very, very early on in the BCC planning process. Engage them in the sense that really tapping into already in step 2 and 3, when you conduct your desk review, when you use the PESTA tool to understand, you do your stakeholder analysis, really understanding what influence do these local leaders have, and what are their perceptions and opinions about the behaviors you are trying to promote in the community. What's really critical, and what I often see as being missed in engaging local leaders, is that we often go to these local leaders presenting them a predefined solution. Yeah, so we say we have this product or this behavior, and we know it's good. Can you help us promote it? But what's an even more effective strategy is to go in and speak to those local leaders to understand what concerns do they think the community has. What are some of those key problems in the community? And then trying to tie your behavior in with that. Yeah, so really engage them, because then they will feel like they are the ones that voiced the problem, and together you came up with a solution.
Yeah, that's great. You know, that's some really helpful feedback for those of us that are working at the advocacy sort of leadership, working with leaderships and communities for nutrition.
And I think what's also really important is to not shy away. And I've seen that, I understand that it is a very, religion especially, you know, is a very sensitive topic. But I think it's really important not to shy away to at least propose strategies such as, for example, embedding some of your content and some of your narrative that you will develop in your creative design into sermon guides, for example, and, you know, be free to ask the religious leaders whether this is something they would be confident to include in their prayers, or in their you know, in their Sunday messes. And of course, make sure that this is agreed with your brain trust and your stakeholders. But what's important is that when the community hears messages from the local leaders, that they feel that it's actually something coming from them rather than something they were asked to carry further.
Great. Thanks, Yana. So there's a few questions here around monitoring and evaluation. And just to say to participants that we'll discuss monitoring and evaluation in webinar 4. So that's our next and final webinar. So we'll take those then. Another question is there, sometimes, you know, for example, particularly in government programs, there's not a lot of money to hire external consultants to do the creative design piece. So actually creating the content for you. So what are some other ways that one might be able to draw on the expertise, or can some program managers get training on this to be able to develop content, creative content?
You know, if you talk about building creative content based on research, solid research that you conduct, so we have the research, yeah, we have had budget to conduct research, yeah, we know the key insights, but what we don't have money for is that creative translation of the research into content. I think if that is the case, a lot of the times you can conduct some very effective and extremely fun workshops where you also invite your audience and your key stakeholders, and you basically put your heads together and brainstorm around, you know, what could this content look like, brainstorm messages, because you know the insights. And I think sometimes we have more creativity in us and more ideas than we allow us. And you can, if you really bring together a bunch of people that are excited about the project, I think you can actually even try to create concepts yourself. What's important is that you then don't go ahead and print 1 million copies of those posters you designed in a one-day workshop, but that you actually go ahead and pre-test those concepts with the audience. But I have personally been involved and also led those creative design workshops where, you know, we developed a brand with a whole brand with health professionals, for example. Of course, this workshop was led you know, by myself, and I have a little bit of experience in that, but I think you can certainly pull up some training material and resources online on how to create a brainstorming around creative materials.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Yana. Sometimes we don't have to spend a lot of money on hiring creative agencies to do this. That oftentimes some of us are actually quite excellent creators ourselves. Some of us also have drawing capabilities. Some of us are really good writers as well.
Yeah.
I know I've used in the past when I was working in Mexico, also on a very limited budget. I hired a graphic designer, for example. So I didn't need to hire a whole agency. I just hired specifically the type of expertise that I needed. And in a lot of places, there's graphic designers. In every university, there's an art department. And I'm sure a lot of people would be willing and very much interested in participating in these creative processes. So that's a good point. Some other questions are coming in, and I think this is just related, actually bounces quite nicely off the pre-testing of what you just mentioned. And the question that comes from Soma, asking, how important is pre-testing of communication design products when there is no time, and these products are based on a good communication research?
Well, I think I would almost have to, if I could ask a question back, what is the communication research? Because if this material is based on, I'm going to give an example. If you are promoting breastfeeding and you have done a lot of research around similar interventions that have worked in not only similar geographical and social contexts, but also addressed basically the same audience you're addressing, and so on and so on. You can try to launch these materials, but honestly, to me, the time factor versus the cost efficiency factor is something that is really, really something that you really should consider. Because if you say there is no time to pre-test, I can argue, but is there time to waste money on printing out hundreds of copies of materials that you have no idea, or that you may think will work, but you're actually not sure? So to me, you know, if I could say that there is a key element in the BCC design process I would never ever skip, it would be the pre-testing. I would rather try to make the pre-testing as concise as possible, which you can do, you know, you can pre-test in a couple of hours with a small sample. You can go to the health centers where you're working and show the material around at least the staff, or tap into a running you know, counseling session, distribution of products, to say, hey, you know, we're doing this, how do you feel about this material? I would never, honestly, I would never skip that step. No matter how good you think the material is developed based on previous work, I wouldn't skip this step.
Yeah, that's a good point. Some pre-testing, often people think of that as it's an elaborate stage of research that has to happen. And as you said, sometimes all it needs is just even going into your local health center that's nearby and testing some of these ideas for basic even readability. Can people understand what's being conveyed? And I think that's critical. Another question, Yana, and I think it involves also this idea of pre-testing. How do we know that the exchange that we've identified is actually the right exchange?
Right. I think this is a very good point, but I think when you look at client research insights, even if you're not a specialist in this field, if I gave you 10 interview transcripts, for example, and asked you read them, pick up on some recurring themes, it's likely you would pick up on things people value, and things people value are, or things people are concerned about. Of course, there can be lots of things people value in their lives, and that is where you have to try and go for the one factor you think will jive the most with the audience, as it has potential to be, the one exchange you choose has to have potential to be tied in with your behavioral ask. Yeah, so like, let's take the example of the crabs. It was a natural tie-in of what people value with the behavior that the NGO was trying to promote. And at the end of the day, when you pre-test your concepts that will be based on your exchange, this is when you really know whether you are on the right track, whether you selected the right exchange.
Right, again, so pre-testing comes up again as an indispensable, not to be skipped part of the BCC process cycle.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just quickly scanning the questions. Another question has come in regarding the implementation plan. And the question reads, what is the relative importance of mass media communication, small group communication, or interpersonal communication like home visits? Like, for example, in nutrition, home visits seem really important. I guess a question for you, Yana, is if you can comment on the relative importance of these different communication channels.
Sure. We had mass media, home visits, and what was the third one?
Small group communication.
Small group. Okay. All right. So I think that, first of all, one sort of note of caution perhaps with mass media, there are examples of excellent mass media campaigns out there, but they are only as excellent as the budget that was put in them, and the scope of the whole strategy. I think that we often default to mass media without really understanding the purpose of using mass media. So if you lay out those three communication tactics you just mentioned, in-house, small group, and mass media, again, ask yourself, where does our audience stand right now in their stages of change? Do they have awareness and information? Is all they need support to actually do the behavior? Then in-home visits, where you have people come in and actually show your audience how to do the behavior, sit with them and have one-on-one sessions, listen to their concerns, but ultimately get them to do the behavior right there and right then this is the right thing to do. If what you first need to do is to build awareness about the issue on a large scale, not just with your primary audience, but also with peers, with stakeholders, mass media can be a very powerful tool, but mass media alone is unlikely going to give you what that in-home communication will give you. So it's really about what we discussed earlier, about understanding which activity to launch first and how to face those activities. If your entire strategy is about raising awareness, I'm going to argue you're not doing BCC, because BCC has to have behavioral goals. But if you are wanting to just raise awareness, mass media might be your way to go. But again, the small group communication is also something that's really good to use when you know that there is uncertainty about the value of the behavior in the community. There is a lot of questions that still need to be answered. Also, a very good way of using small group communication is when you have a mix of audiences that is already doing the behavior, so the doers, the ones that are the champions, and those who are still suspicious. Bringing those together and doing some kind of testimonial sharing can be very powerful. So the choice of your communication tactics will depend on where your audience stands right now and where you need them to be.
That's great. I think that's an excellent learning. That should be a logo. Where is my audience now and where do they need to be? And really picking your communication tactics based on that, Yana. That's fantastic. We have time just for one more question. It's coming from Professor Vanush. He asks, can you share your views on social marketing and positive deviance in BCC? Uh-oh, side question.
Look, I think positive deviance is something that is very powerful. We all experience it, you know. I mean, how many times have you been more tempted to buy a product, a watch, a phone, you know, or even a nutritious product that you've heard of having a great reviews on from your peers, as opposed to being tempted to buy something that no one has ever reviewed. I think, yes, positive deviance is very powerful. I use it a lot in my strategies when I know that this is what will jive with my audience, and it's something that, again, you also can pre-test and really nicely understand through your client research. Usually the opinions of others are always important to people. What's really important to pick up on is who exactly is actually driving these opinions, and that's something you can find out through client research. However, I think what we should really refrain from relying on is positive deviance alone. So just because you put up posters where you tell people that others have done it and this is great and so you should do it too, this is obviously not going to, you know, to get your audience to do the behavior alone. So I think, again, positive deviance is a powerful tactic, but I wouldn't use it alone.
Okay, great, Yana. Thanks for that reply. So we have come to the end of our Q&A session, and I'm glad we had a lot of time for this discussion, because I thought the questions were very great questions coming in from the audience, and allowed for further explanation of some of the content that you prepared. So thank you, Yana, for your presentation today. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have now, and we hope that you have found this presentation informative and thought-provoking. So visit our website to stay up to date, where you can find links to this webinar and to our previous webinars in the series. And you can also learn more about our work. In the next webinar, we'll take you through the last step of our BCC process cycle, which is monitoring and evaluation. So for those who had a lot of questions on monitoring and evaluation, don't miss the next webinar. We're also active on social media, and we welcome your thoughts and comments and engagement on Twitter and our LinkedIn page. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a very brief survey about the presentation, and we do ask you to give us your feedback, because we use that feedback to improve the subsequent webinar. And you will also receive a follow-up email in a few weeks with a link to today's webinar recording and a PDF to the slides. So on behalf of Sight and Life, we thank you very, very much for joining us today, and we wish you a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.